Okay, everybody, welcome to Real Crusades History Live. We are very happy today to welcome back one of our favorite guests, Dr. Andrew Latham. Dr. Latham, thanks for being with us tonight.
A pleasure as always.
Hey, everybody, welcome. I can make sure everybody has their feed turned down. Okay, so yeah, I'm J. Stephen Roberts. I'm going to be hosting, and I'm joined by several of our regulars from the Real Crusades History crew. Rand Brown is here. Rand, how you doing, sir?
Doing great. I was glad to be on, and a very warm welcome to our very old friend and former guest, Dr. Latham.
All right, and Peter, welcome to you as well.
Great to be here.
It's Peter Safarian, aka Bohemond, on the line with us. So,
hey.
And Scott, we're kind of having some technical difficulties with Scott Amos, our good buddy there. We'll see if we can make that work out, but if not, he'll be with us in spirit. But anyway, so our topic today is a fun one, and it was Dr. Latham's idea. And Dr. Latham, you're gonna have to forgive me. I know you asked me to call you Andrew, and I will try to remember to do that. I'll try to get over my professor.
Please do.
Yeah. It's like I feel like I'm back in like class or something, and we're like taking a history course with Dr. Latham. So but yeah, Andrew. This was Andrew's idea to do a topic on really the political complexity of medieval Outremer. Well, really all of medieval Syria and Palestine. This theater of where the Crusades of the Holy Land took place. So we're talking, late 11th through 13th centuries. And, I think pretty much any time you'd be looking at this period, it would look like that. Syria does kind of seem to be one of the great battlegrounds of the world, the ancient and medieval world. And this idea that the Crusades were just, two blocks, Crusaders versus Saracens, that's not quite right. It's a little bit more complex than that. But I'm not going to get into it too much. I want to let Andrew here do an introduction for us.
We're all here.
Yeah. So Andrew, do you want to introduce the topic, kind of your thoughts on it?
Yeah. So I think the default setting of most people when they look at medieval Outremer is that it's a clash of civilizations. There's the Muslims, the Islamic world, and on the other hand, there's the Christian world. And the two were always at war because they had diametrically opposed interests, religiously derived interests. And as a scholar of international relations, I can't buy that. The reality is that it was a multipolar, not a bipolar system, a multipolar system in which princes, shorthand for the governing elites, I guess, were pursuing their interest. And once in a while, the 9 numbered Crusades, for example, the religious sort of trumped everything else. But for the most part, they were pursuing very mundane interests. As Thucydides put it, states are motivated, whether we call them states or not, by honor, standing and prestige, interest, whether it's economic or security, and fear, often fear of a rising empire, a rising power that's going to put them in a bad position. And that, as a scholar of international relations, I have to say that never changes. That was true in the Greek world. It was true in Latin Christendom. It was true in Outremer, an offshoot. And it's true today, quite frankly. And so when we look at the politics, the geopolitics of that era in that region, it is a mistake to think that it was always simply Muslims versus Christians.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair way to put it. And, anybody who gets into the Crusades at all is going to notice this very quickly. And I think you're right that there is a caricature out there of this. There's an idea that, okay, well, you've got two sides. You've got the Muslims versus the Crusaders, right? And that is just dreadfully oversimplified. And in fact, it's really even more than just oversimplified. It overlooks just the incredible complexity of what was going on in this region at the time. And when the Crusaders arrive during the First Crusade, they arrive in a place that is extremely complicated in terms of the shifting political realities. I mean, even the newcomers who the Crusaders fought against during the First Crusade, the Seljuk Turks, they had kind of established this widespread dominion over a lot of this region, but even they were very much in a state of civil war and fractured and shifting alliances when the Crusaders arrived. And I kind of think it's interesting. We have this idea that Saladin later on united the Muslim world. This is kind of one of the catchphrases, and it's a simple, kind of elegant little catchphrase that at first when the Crusaders arrived, the Muslims were disunited, and then Saladin united them, and that's how he was able to win his wars against the Crusaders. And there is probably some truth to that. I mean, yes, it's true that Saladin did establish a pretty large dominion, but I think that the idea that he united the Muslim world is definitely not true. There was still this same sort of situation existed, and in fact, it existed within his own Ayyubid dynasty. Once he was gone, the Ayyubids fought each other too. So
almost Saladin's corpse was not even cold before his brother and his son and and so many members of his own family were suddenly at each other's throats.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rent.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that topic up, because when you read the actual history, you realize just how fragile Saladin's Ayyubid coalition really was.
Yeah, I was just going to say, even before that, you have the attempted assassinations against Saladin by the Ismailis as well. So there's definitely, all around the Muslim world, you have this disunity, this tension and aggression between the different factions.
Yeah. Andrew, did you have something?
Yeah, I think that's right. If you look at Saladin, Nur ad-Din, Zengi, it doesn't really matter. They're all interested in building an empire. And to build that empire, they have to defeat primarily, almost exclusively, other Muslim powers. I mean, the Zengi Empire, and after that, even the Ayyubids, but mostly the Zengids, really were based in Mosul and Aleppo. And they were forever looking to grab Damascus, Alexandria, Cairo, right? And those powers, the Fatimids, for example, they had no interest in being incorporated into this gigantic Zengid empire. They really didn't, and they resisted it. And in order to resist it, and this is a lesson, as Thucydides put it, it's a possession for all ages, the truth of this, they allied with anybody, Muslim, Christian, it really didn't matter. You see Damascus allying with Jerusalem. You see the Fatimids allying with Jerusalem against not Saladin, but Nur ad-Din. It's just a huge mistake to think that this was simply always and everywhere Christian versus Muslim. This was, but though it was at times that, but most often it was simply multipolar geopolitics playing itself out as it has forever.
Yeah, and I think that we don't want to make the mistake of, I think that there is kind of this modern tendency to say, oh, okay, well, that element was there, and it absolutely was there, and it was oftentimes at the forefront of the mind of, various rulers and princes and that kind of thing. But there was also the religious element was also there too, and I think it was important to these concepts of crusade and jihad. They were important, and I think that for a lot of these rulers, they didn't see a conflict with personal ambition, personal dynastic ambition, and the pursuit of a religious end. I think that this idea that there's this inherent problem between those two things, like this inherent contradiction between the two things in our world today, like, oh, well, you don't care about religious or spiritual goals, you're just after personal power and personal glory. I think a lot of these rulers kind of thought those could go hand in hand. I mean, I know, for example, when we look at some of the ideas that were coming out of the Crusader camp after the triumph of the First Crusade. Like Fulcher of Chartres, for example, really thought that the success of the Crusaders was a sign of God's favor. So like their political and military success was a sign of God, approving of them and wanting to bless them. So
I think that's right. Periodically, that religious impulse really trumps, if I can use that word, trumps everything else. But often it doesn't. It's in the so. For example, before Saladin, who was, I think, a pious man. We can overstate that, but I think he was a pious man. But his motives were not primarily pious. It was an empire-building, dynastic thing. Jihad before Saladin was a non-thing in the Muslim world, and crusade was a thing sometimes, and it was the most important thing sometimes, but often it took a backseat to simple European-style Latin Christendom, as they would have styled it, but European-style geopolitics. So I think you're right. At some points in the history of Outremer, crusade trumped everything. At some points in the history of the Islamic world, jihad trumps everything. But I would say like 75% of the time, those were in the deep background.
yeah, I think anybody who looks at Saladin's career, I mean, we focus so much on the Battle of Hattin and the Third Crusade, but I mean, the bulk of his career was spent campaigning against other Muslims. In particular, he was very focused on trying to dismantle the Zengid state. He kind of like, in fact, that whole process is really interesting. Saladin and the Ayyubids start out as clients of the Zengids, and then Nur ad-Din actually sends Saladin down to Egypt to appropriate it for the Zengids. And Nur ad-Din sort of had this idea of he was going to gain control of wealthy Fatimid Egypt, incorporate that into his dominion, and then use that to attack the Crusaders and dismantle the Crusader States. So he was like, there's sort of an idea of I'm going to really do something for Islam, right? Well, Saladin then turns around and betrays Nur ad-Din. Basically, like once he gets in control of Egypt on Nur ad-Din's behalf, he pretty much breaks with him and establishes his own state. That's sort of the beginning of the Ayyubid state.
That's right. It's your standard, almost European, grubby, dynastic politics. And there's an overlay. And I don't want to minimize or dismiss the religious dimension here, because I think actually there's a very powerful motivating force in 1095 and at several other junctures on the Christian side and on the Muslim side as well. But we have to balance an appreciation, as I know you do, of the religious motivations at particular points, but then the grubby, mundane, day-to-day, dynastic building, state building kinds of things. And that complicates the picture enormously. It is not simply, as Samuel Huntington would have us believe, a clash of civilizations. It was way more complicated than that. And I know our listeners get that, but it bears restating periodically. It really wasn't just two tectonic plates, Christianity and Islam, clashing into each other. It wasn't true then, and it's not true now. It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting. There's kind of this idea that the arrival of the Crusaders kind of created this shockwave in the Muslim world, and I think that can be overstated. Like the Crusaders seem to have kind of become a part of the local, crazy, fractious political scene pretty easily, and they were able to find allies among the Muslims. I mean, early on, like I think it's probably like either 1110 or 1115, or during the reign of Baldwin I of Jerusalem, we've got a situation where I believe it was Bursuk, who was a Turk from Iraq, who was coming in to try to gain control of Syria, and the emir of Damascus, Toktekin, and the Ortakids, who were Turks who controlled like Aleppo and some of that stuff. They allied with King Baldwin I of Jerusalem and Roger of Salerno, the Prince of Antioch, against this force that was coming in from the east. This Sunni Muslim force. They allied with the Crusaders to try to keep that out because they did not want to become subsumed within this Bursuk's project. They didn't want to be conquered by him. So, yeah,
I think that's right. That's a very old story. When there's a rising power, and we're confronting this today, I don't want to torture that analogy, but we're confronting this today. There's a rising power. Other powers have to make a decision. Do you bandwagon, join with the rising power and hope for the best, or do you counterbalance? Do you find allies that will help you resist the hegemony, to use the technical term, of this the potential hegemony of this rising power? And I think that was true then, and I think it's true now. And the other thing I would say is that in the Muslim world, the Crusades until the late 19th century were an irrelevance. They won. It wasn't a big deal. The center of gravity was Mosul and Aleppo and Damascus. It wasn't really Jerusalem, wasn't that important to them. The tale has been appropriated in recent decades, recent years, by Islamists, political Islamists, violent ones in particular, who have a particular story to tell. But if you historicize this and you look back at the reality of the way in which the Islamic world understood what we call the Crusades, it was a sideshow. It was nothing. There was nothing to them.
It was a very obscure part of history. But yeah, go ahead, Peter. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna, Dr. Latham, when you said a few minutes ago that jihad before Saladin was practically non-existent, what exactly did you mean by that?
What I meant was Saladin underwent a personal conversion. I think, history sort of teaches us this. He was a devout Muslim. Whether that actually shaped and determined his politics, that's another question altogether. But Nuruddin Zengi, these people did not think in those categories. This was not a religious conflict for them. There's some debate in the historiography about whether the Crusades were a derivative of Jihad or vice versa, but it's pretty clear that before Saladin, nobody was thinking in those terms. And even Saladin, though personally devout, it's not clear that he was motivated by the word the Jihad, as we call it today.
I think a very important distinction to make, and it's a historical as well as just a sort of general academic distinction. But I think you're touching on, Dr. Latham, and it harkens to some books that I'm reading right now, just about the relationship between religion and the state during the medieval period. Is that these were not religious wars in the sense that modernity understands the term religious wars.
Yeah.
I think the term religious wars in the post French Revolution world order means something very different than what we call the religious wars of the pre-modern era. And back then you didn't have wars motivated by religion. You simply had religion or religious practice infused into every aspect of life back then, and it was a more harmonious arrangement. It was less bombastic. It was less ideological, and it was more just kind of a feature or a facet of the reality of the world as they saw it at that time.
I think that's exactly right. What I say to my students is that in medieval times, divine law was treated the same way that we treat physics. It just simply is. That's the way we understand the world and we act in the world.
Exactly.
And they didn't make this radical distinction between religion and secular and all. They simply understood the world in terms of religious categories, and they acted in the world in exactly those terms. So I think you're absolutely right.
I do have to say, I think Nur ad-Din seemed to be pretty, he did seem to be given to using sort of jihadi type rhetoric. From what I remember, he kind of almost sort of was a proto Saladin in that way, and I think we get possibly some similar stuff from Zengi. I'd have to look specifically, but
didn't Nur ad-Din kill all the Christians in Damascus at one point, or was that even religiously motivated or just politically motivated?
That I don't remember if Nur ad-Din did that or not. Does anybody remember anything like that?
I think a lot of those instances, and Dr. Latham, you can correct me if I'm incorrect, but a lot of those sorts of instances, you got to remember, this was a time in world history and human history where the universality of religions was not really a thing, and that those who followed particular religions were usually also people of particular ethnic identities, from particular regions of the world, of the known world, and typically subscribe to very specific ethnic and cultural identities. So yes, when you read the medieval sources, especially those from the Crusading era and from Outremer in particular, when they talk of the Christians, usually they're either talking about Armenians or they're talking about Franks. And so, yeah, typically if they were, if a Turkic or other Islamic leader took a city and wanted to clear it of people who would most likely lead resistance to their rule, they were probably going to wipe out what they would call the Christians at that time, which were also the Western European Franks or the Armenian Eastern Christians.
Yeah. I want to. I don't want us to be in danger of kind of going too much to the other side. Like, I definitely think that, if there's no question that dynastic concerns were very important, sort of day-to-day politics. Oftentimes that was at the front of people's minds. But I do think when it comes to this aspect of like crusade versus jihad and the religious element to these conflicts, I do think that for both sides, there was kind of a sense that was the higher cause. Like, that was the thing that should be done, that really should be done. And oftentimes when leaders were engaged in more of the kind of grubby, day-to-day politics, like, just securing my dynasty, and I'm going to, like, for example, Saladin's various nephews vying for power, there still was a sense in the Islamic community that there's something higher about the pursuit of jihad. Just like, and I think the Crusaders had that idea too.
Yeah, absolutely. I would not disagree with that at all. I would think that it's the great historical question of how far does ideology really get you, in history? And yeah, there's maybe moments where the ideology actually does come to the top, and world leaders sacrifice the mundane for the higher, and then there's the vast majority of the time where the more real demands take precedence, or as Dr. Latham says, the more grubby affairs,
So here's my take on this, which is that I cannot stand it when my students just can't believe that anybody would act on the basis of religious conviction. It's always a smokescreen or something else, and I don't believe that. I think people actually do act on the basis. If you look at 1095, Urban's call for the First Crusade, people were motivated. People are complicated and they do things for right, but they were motivated by religious conviction. There's no doubt in my mind about that. but I would make a distinction between the Crusaders who were called and the people who lived in the region, and there's not a bright line between the two, but I think the political authorities in Outremer had to be as concerned with geopolitics as with crusade and religion, whereas the people who took the cross from France and England and Germany, amongst other places, they had to be attentive to their own politics as well. But I think they were genuinely motivated by religious fervor. And I think the same is true on the other side as well. I resist the idea that it was all a clash of civilizations. I think it was just way, way more complicated than that, which is not to diminish the religious element. I don't do that at all, but it is to put it in a broader context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you hear that today in the modern context with current Islamic Jihad today. People will always say things like, "Oh, no religion commands this," and not to get into the weeds of modern politics today, but just to illustrate the point, this idea that people just cannot wrap their heads around the idea that yes, people are motivated by powerful ideology even today. So there's no reason why back then they wouldn't have been motivated by a powerful ideology.
Well, and to Dr. Latham's point about his students who just can't wrap their minds around somebody being motivated by religion, I think it speaks way more to sort of the postmodern disaffected and sort of just general bad attitude when it comes to anything religious. This idea of like, oh, all of religion is just this sham, cover for, lesser motives and things like that. And it really does. I think it's
they're just using it to justify their own hatred.
Yeah, exactly. And they're sort of subscribing religion to this automatic sort of toxic zone of behavior. And the only response I would have is to those types of individuals is that religion has been responsible, or at least in the West, and in many other places in the world, organized religion has been responsible for some of the greatest flowerings of human civilization and human culture, the likes of which secular culture, or secularism, if you can even call that a thing, has really failed to match the accomplishments of. And
I think that's right. And the proof lies in this. Visit Chartres Cathedral and then visit any downtown building constructed in the last 20 years in the United States or Western Europe. Brutalism versus that. Can you imagine what it would take multi-generationally to build a Chartres Cathedral? We couldn't do it today. We couldn't do it.
Right. So, believe it or not, Dr. Latham, I was actually thinking Chartres Cathedral as I was talking. So it was good to see we're on the same wavelength.
Yeah. Great minds think alike.
Rand's trying really hard to get on Latham's good side here.
Yeah, I think that okay, and you, Andrew, you talking about your students not being able to understand that the strong motivating force that religion was in the Middle Ages, that was kind of a problem with mainstream historians in the early 20th century and the 19th century, like almost kind of this Marxist interpretation of history that, oh, well, really the motivations are economic, the kings and the popes are just trying to get rich, and religion is just almost like it was this elaborate scam, which I think is just so ridiculous, because the medieval world was in a lot of ways was more blunt, was more just straightforward. This is what we're doing. I mean, it was not nearly as the politics weren't nearly as politicians weren't nearly so insincere in their public proclamations as they are now.
I think that's right. The baleful influence of Marxism on the interpretation of the Crusades via Soviet historiography. I mean, they played a huge role in shaping, but also Stephen Runciman, right, who's writing in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Holocaust, and all the rest of it, and he's thinking, religion is just a terrible and baleful influence on the human condition. Okay, that's fine. But if you, as I know you guys have, if you read the sources, if you probe a little bit, what you find is, yes, human beings are fallen. We know that. Human beings will pursue their own weird self-interests as they understand them, but religion inflects the way that they understand their self-interests. And to poo-poo or dismiss or write out, as my kids say, I don't even know what it means anymore, Photoshop, to use an old archaic term, Photoshop religion out of this historical equation is a mistake. People actually got up in the morning back in the day and conducted their lives as if they believed in God, as if, you know, Jesus was crucified and all the rest of it, and conducted not just their personal lives, but their politics on that basis. And to ignore that is to be profoundly anti-scientific, profoundly ahistorical. It is to miss the point.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And just in terms of this issue of, you know, the religious motivation versus the day-to-day thing, I do think that one feature we see with these sort of frontier societies, like the areas of the world where crusading and jihad were happening, you know, Spain and the Holy Land is a perfect example. The locals there do tend to have a certain understanding with the sort of, you know, great enemy, if you will. And an example of this for me is like, you know, this author, Usama ibn Munkid, who, you know, is kind of one of the famous Muslim writers from, you know, the 12th century Syrian Crusades. He talks about, you know, going to Jerusalem and interacting with some Templars who he describes as friends. So that is really fascinating. Like, here we are, you know, if you read his work, you can't help but conclude this is a guy who is very sincere about Islam. He firmly believed in the idea of holy war against the Franks. You know, he wanted the Crusaders to be defeated. I mean, it's like, you know, God destroy them, this and this. But at the same time, in his daily interactions, like, he was a diplomat, so he often, you know, went from the great courts throughout, you know, both the Christian and Muslim held areas. He describes, you know, interacting with these Templars, and he calls them friends. And, you know, the interaction he describes is a pleasant one. He talks about how they kind of helped him to find a place to pray and kind of got him away from a guy who was sort of harassing him. And so I think that maybe, you know, the way I look at that is I absolutely think that those Templars were sincere in their dedication to crusade, in their dedication to the idea of, you know, Christian triumphalism and Christian rule in the Holy Land, just as Usama was sincere in his dedication to the idea of jihad and Muslim rule in the Holy Land. But they could have a mutual respect for each other in the day-to-day interactions. And I also think possibly too that when you've got two sides like that do have quite a bit of a commitment to this higher goal, they can kind of respect one another in that commitment. Like, the Muslims and Christians both respected each other when they fought valiantly. And one of the Christian individuals who they kind of talked about with not a lot of respect was Frederick II, because they thought he was insincere in his Christian faith, which they found that disturbing. So, yeah.
So that's an interesting insight, and I think it's largely right. Let me sort of widen the perspective a little bit and talk about. So Benedict Anderson is a bit of a Marxist, but has some interesting things to say about nationalism. Talks about long distance nationalism. It's way easier to be a fanatic if you don't actually have to interact with the other on a daily basis in the souk or the bazaar or whatever the case might be. And I think that's exactly right. The French and the English and the Germans were often way more, fanatical is not quite the right word, but I'm going to use it anyway, than the people in Outremer who lived cheek by jowl with the Muslim other on a daily basis, and the Jewish other for that matter, and found a modus vivendi. They found a way to live with the other that was often inconceivable to the people who lived literally thousands of miles away.
Yeah. Well, and I think you see that repeatedly, especially later on in the crusading era, with some of the later numbered crusades. You see this very sharp contrast between the native Latin residents of Outremer and the Crusaders that come from Europe. And oftentimes they're like even their goals are at odds with one another. Sometimes you almost kind of get the feeling that the native Latins of Outremer kind of looked at some of the Crusaders that came from Europe as almost kind of a nuisance.
Well, the Second Crusade is kind of a good example of that. Like, the idea was that the guys who arrived wanted to go after Damascus because, in part because it was sort of a famous site from the scripture, whereas Queen Melisande and then Raymond of Antioch wanted to focus on Aleppo and for strategic reasons. So that kind of but on top of that.
But I think you saw it another times. You especially saw it during Frederick II's tenure in Outremer. You definitely saw that very pronounced animosity between the two groups. And then you also saw it with things like the Fifth Crusade, where here you have the military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, who they've been in the Holy Land for generations. They know the warfare. They know how war is best waged in that part of the world. They know the enemy better. And then you kind of have these crusading armies that come from Europe that they're trying to advise, and then they go off and they do like the complete opposite of what they advised. And and you do almost kind of have to wonder sometimes if there was more than a little bit of just kind of frustration on behalf of the Latin, the Outremer Latins with their Western their Western European counterparts.
I think that's right, and it boils down to this for me. At least in the early Crusades, up to the third, maybe the fourth, the people in what we now call Western Europe who took the cross had a very specific interest. Let's do the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and then get the hell back home, because who knows what's going on back there? Who knows who's trying to stab me in the back, take my land, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the people who lived in Outremer, the settlers, and especially the local aristocracy, nobility, they realized that they were playing the long game. It wasn't simply a pilgrimage that was over in a month or 6 months or 8 months. It was, we're here for the long haul, and we have to make some accommodations. We have to think strategically. And so I think they just had two very different mindsets, two very different sets of interests. And ultimately, I think that was the demise of Latin Christendom in Outremer, that they simply couldn't synthesize or reconcile these two completely different sets of interests.
Well, yeah, not enough people wanted to settle there. Too many people wanted to come and then leave.
That's right.
It was a pilgrimage site, and I can imagine it probably. A lot of the area was very hot and inhospitable. So
France is nicer.
Yeah,
southern France is much nicer.
Or Tuscany.
Yeah.
Or Tuscany, Umbria.
Yeah.
And to kind of add to that point, the Fifth Crusade is so interesting because over the course of that, so many armies came and left. I mean, and again, it's because there was a concept of, okay, we've done our part, in this holy war. Now we can, we've got our indulgence. Now let's go. I mean, not everybody. The main focus wasn't the strategic
exactly
for everybody.
Which I think is a very important point to bring up to those who constantly try to subsume or absorb the Crusades into this 19th century or not so much 19th century, but more 20th century and beyond anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism narrative. of the Crusades was, it was just almost like it was some sort of proto 19th century colonialism adventure, and just the idea is ludicrous when you actually look at the real history and what these people were actually, the armies that did go to Outremer were actually motivated by, and the fact that once they felt they had accomplished their objective, they all left. Like nobody stayed, except for maybe a small handful of
exactly right. It really, I loathe and despise the proto-imperialist narrative. It wasn't that. I mean, the Europeans were guilty of that many centuries later, but they weren't guilty of it then. This was not driven by a desire to grab land or displace the natives. It was initially very much a religious impulse that drove this. Later, once Europeans, if we can use that anachronistic term, had settled there, then more mundane things came into play. But this was not proto-imperialism by any means. That's simply a way of slandering the West, which is very common these days.
Yeah. Yep. Some good points from everybody. Does anybody have any further comments about this particular issue, or do we want to kind of hit some other parts of the article?
Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to actually read the article before I jumped on this podcast.
You don't know what you've missed.
I have an idea, but I will eventually. It's just unfortunately work can be a little demanding sometimes. But one question I have to ask, and it may be covered in the article and it may not, but something that's always fascinated me about the Crusader States in Outremer during the crusading era from the 11th to the 13th centuries is the sort of hybrid culture that developed there, and I think I'm sure there are people out there who've done much more in-depth studies on this, but it's always something that's kind of fascinated me, because to me it really did seem like for a certain period of time, Latin Outremer sort of became this crossroads of the world at the time, or at least of the known world. And you had so many different elements at play there. From a cultural perspective, you had Western European pilgrims. You had you had a Byzantine. I'm sure you had a significant Byzantine influence. You had Armenians. You had the various Muslim and Islamic.
It's almost like a medieval Brazil.
Yeah, it really was. There's just kind of this. It was kind of this fascinating sort of medieval melting pot, or sort of cosmopolitan society that I think you get little glimpses of from the source materials.
Well, Rand, have you ever looked at the Melisande Psalter?
I have, yeah. No, I actually saw the Melisande Psalter in person. In the British Museum. It was in a it was a traveling exhibit there in London, and was able to see it. And it's
very
really,
Eastern.
It's superb, and it's this beautiful sort of hybrid. Or example of sort of a hybrid culture that I think really challenges the sort of modern anachronism that medieval culture was this was this stolid white European basically everything the toxic white masculinity or however they want to categorize it. That there really was a form of multiculturalism, just not in the modern sense, that we know today. And I would love to know what work has been done in that regard, and sort of what has been revealed about this kind of fascinating frontier crossroads of cultures in the medieval world.
So my take on that is that when you look at Spain or Sicily or Outremer, you do see layers of cultures, ethnic, linguistic, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and those come in different flavors, Byzantine versus Latin Christendom, Sunni versus Shia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it puts the lie to the whole notion of a clash of civilizations. What you have is a lot of borrowing culturally. Aristotle partly comes back to the West through Islam, not entirely. Bits of Aristotle had been preserved, but not the really important stuff. And that's just the tip of an iceberg. There's a lot of cultural exchange. We call it cultural appropriation now, which is wrong. It's just the usual diffusion of cultural ideas across very permeable cultural civilizational borders. The second thought I had is that we don't actually have a good sense in Outremer, for example, how many people were Christian. And again, that comes in like 12 different flavors.
Mhm.
How many were Jewish? How many were Muslim? I mean, there's the historical records. There was no census bureau, keeping track of these things. So it's hard to know. And some estimates are that it's predominantly Christian, even at the time of the First Crusade. And some estimates are, cut the other way. But my takeaway from that is that these were not hermetically sealed cultures.
Mhm.
These were cultures which shared ideas, whether it's numbers. The whole alcohol is an Arabic word, as many other of our words are that we don't even sort of recognize anymore. And the same was true the other way. There was just a lot of diffusion of cultural norms, ideas, practices, et cetera, et cetera. And it just gives the lie to this notion that there are these tectonic plates, Christianity, Islam, which crashed into each other in the Crusades or in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. It's just not true.
I think, yeah, definitely that concept of clash of civilizations, that is certainly a modern sort of concept, right? But I do think that we can sort of look at, like, there is kind of an encounter between Christendom and Islam. And it is kind of, yes, it is like, you can't like call any one thing that. I mean, there's a lot of, very specific things, specific little conflicts and little dynasties and kingdoms fighting against each other. But there kind of was, there definitely was an Islam and a Christendom, and they did kind of vie for space to some extent. I mean,
yes, I would agree.
And I think that there was a sense of this too at the time. Like, one thing I always go back to is this really interesting passage from Ibn al-Athir, where he talks about, the rise of the Franks, and he talks about how they were coming after the Muslims in Spain. They took control of Toledo in 1085, and then how they were coming after the Muslims in Sicily, and then now they're coming after us in Palestine. They're taking Jerusalem, and so, and he's really, when he talks about that, he's talking about three very different regional things going on. He's talking about the Kingdom of Leon, which is conquering like this Muslim Taifa state in Toledo. He's talking about the Normans of southern Italy going after, a couple of different Arab factions in Sicily, and then of course he's talking about the Crusaders in Palestine. And so yeah, that's all very. There's a lot of regional stuff there. This is not a monolithic thing by any means, but he is kind of tapping into this encounter between Christendom and Islam. And he's basically saying that he kind of understands it that way. I mean, he doesn't view, the Muslims in Spain as just like, oh, well, that's some other dynasty and kingdom there. He does, that's Islam. And that's kind of part of his larger sort of cosmology.
I absolutely agree. I think they did encounter each other, and sometimes the encounter was marked by hostility and enmity and war and bad things, and sometimes the encounter was, wow, that's not a bad idea. Let me think about that for a little bit. Now, I don't want to overstate this. I guess I'm pushing back really tonight against the clash of civilizations thesis, but I don't want to push back too far, because that was there. It's just that's not all that was there. There was a lot of what we would consider to be fairly normal geopolitics playing itself out as well. There was a lot of cultural diffusion, not appropriation, diffusion, just ideas crossing over that civilizational boundary. Sometimes, having a big theological impact, sometimes having a big political impact. I guess, to sound like my 13-year-old daughter sometimes, it's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there were multiple competing interests, and an individual human being is complicated. An individual human being that they have familial interests, they have business interests, they have friends, they might have different organizations they belong to, and that's kind of what a medieval king was in that situation. I mean, we take somebody like King Baldwin the First of Jerusalem. I mean, he was a very practical guy. He wheeled and dealed and made alliances where he needed to. He made alliances with Muslims at times, but I think he also was committed to the idea of holding the Holy Sepulchre for Christendom. I think he was a religious guy. So yeah, I think it's like it's just, you can't oversimplify this, and you have to look at the whole thing, which includes, like you're saying, Andrew, these different spheres. I mean, there's the religious elements, there's the idea of conflict between two great religions, but then there's also smaller political issues and dynastic issues.
I think that's right. And I don't want to complexify things too much either, but it really is not simply a binary Christian Muslim thing. Even within those two worlds, there's Byzantine versus Latin, there's Sunni versus Shia, and more complexity there. And so when we look back at this and we try to radically historicize it, try to put ourselves in their shoes, we need to bear these things in mind. I know you guys all know this. I'm preaching to the choir here, but the broader audience might not fully appreciate that complexity.
I think if you could ever find, if you ever had to choose a motto for the study of history, it's complicated. Fits pretty well.
Yes.
And that's the difference between history, the study of history, and the study of political science.
Exactly.
The historians are always looking for the complexity, and the political scientists, to their great shame and disgrace, are always looking to simplify things and boil it down to a couple of laws.
Hence why I moved from the latter to the former. So
I'm stuck in between. I'm very much stuck in between.
I had a professor once who said that history is just reality. It's just the truth about how nothing is elegantly simple, whereas philosophers and people involved in literature and stuff are always trying to get away from that messy reality.
That's right. We're political scientists are always looking for the covering law. Okay, we've got these 5 cases. What do they have in common, and what can we boil that down to? And I'm a political scientist by training and maybe by inclination, but I push back against that. I like the historical sensibility. I think that it leavens things a little bit.
Yeah.
Modern political scientists would say something like, "Well, you have your history, and I have my history."
Oh, believe me, I know.
Yeah, as someone who my undergrad was in political science, and then I went and got a master's in military history. So I made the jump, or I guess you could say I jumped the ship.
No, I think you made the right move.
I do, and I think what drew me to history is very much what you're talking about. Is it's the realism of it. It's it's one of the reasons I tell people often that I feel like ideology is a criminally overrated phenomenon, especially historically. I think ideology only gets you so far, especially modern ideology, or at least ideology in the modern sense. It just seems like it's such a hollow phenomenon that it makes a lot of noise and can often do a lot of damage in the short term, but really in the long term it just doesn't have that staying power at all. And really at the end of the day, it's you find yourself back in that situation of it's complicated. Like why?
It is complicated, and the big
because
mistake that people make, I think, is to take contemporary political science categories and project them back on medieval realities, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I think modern people trying to get into the mindset of medieval people. Well, that's the problem. Most people don't. They don't think, how can I understand the medieval world and the way medieval people thought in their own terms? They just start taking the modern world and imposing it on the medieval world. So, and Jinsul is going to jump all over me for doing that. He says that like I constantly repeat that.
It's not my fault this time, Jinsul. I swear.
Yeah.
But I think it's true. I think it's very true. We do try very hard to impose our categories, whether they're Marxist or feminist or whatever they might be, on a world in which these concepts were utterly inconceivable, not even alien, inconceivable.
You're telling me Muhammad wasn't a third wave 21st century feminist, Dr. Latham?
No, he was a transgender advocate. Everybody knows that.
Okay, and now I'm officially going to get a.
You could believe that.
Definitely going to get letters.
Okay.
we just got what is it? What was it when YouTube?
Demonetized.
Yeah, we just got demonetized.
I think ratioed is the term.
Might as well happen now, Rand.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, and to me, that's one of the things that's so fascinating about the medieval world is the way these people thought. It is so different than the way we think, and it's interesting, and it kind of makes you realize how dependent our mindsets are on the era we come from. And guys, it's just so boring to try to make these people think like us.
So let me talk as a professor for just 2 seconds. We spend at my college, which is a very good college, I love it. We spend a lot of money sending students abroad to learn about other cultures. And I'm thinking to myself, well, we can send them geographically across the world, or we can send them temporally back in time. That's a different culture. It's a radically different culture. Even if you're born in England, the England of 1295 is a very different place than the England of today. And so I actually think I'm engaged in this multicultural project in a very constructive way. I want my students to understand that these people weren't evil and they weren't stupid. They simply had a radically different way of understanding the world and acting in the world. And if they can come away from one of my courses understanding that, I'm happy.
Outstanding. So I'm going to jump over to the chat here and see if anybody has any questions for Andrew. While we've got Dr. Andrew Latham here, does anybody have any interesting questions they'd like to shoot at him?
There were a couple that I saw, and I'm trying to go back to them, but they were kind of early on.
Yeah. Oh, and while we're waiting for questions, Scott, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Hey, there he is.
God!
I took off my headphones and I'm just speaking through my microphone now and got my regular speakers on. So I'm here.
There he
Okay,
is.
good.
Great to have you back.
It's good to hear your voice, Scott.
This has been I've really enjoyed just listening.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you and your big happy kitty there.
Yeah, I need to get Longshanks back, but for the kitty, he'll be back.
I don't know. The cat's kind of comforting. It's sort of
The cat is very comforting. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
Longshanks is a little kind of like,
Nice contrast to the brooding Crusaders.
Yeah. Okay.
I do have a question for Dr.
Y'all
Latham.
can hear me, but no, it's been a great discussion, and I've just really enjoyed listening. So, I don't think I have anything additional to contribute at this point. But
Peter, you said you had something?
Yes, I do. Dr. Latham, any news on when we can expect the sequel to the Holy Lands?
Well, therein lies a tale. My original publisher went out of business. I don't think it was because they published my novel, although I can't be sure. So halfway through, well, a third of the way through the sequel, I got this news, and it was a bit disheartening. And I do have a day job. I've been working on some academic stuff, but I can't make any promises, but I'm thinking 18 months.
All right.
Awesome. Look forward to that.
I think we have a question.
Yeah, we got several good ones here, actually.
Yeah, and this is from our very good friend Jinsul. How many troops could each Christian principality or Muslim emir summon for a campaign?
Ooh, I like that.
That is a good question. Unlike today, or the First and Second World Wars, I think, are iconic for us. Countries mobilized literally millions. The United States, 12 million, and these were in the tens of thousands at the most, and they were of dubious. They didn't sign up like American Marines or soldiers or airmen do today. They kind of signed up, but then they could leave whenever they want. It wasn't.
Armies were very fluid affairs back then.
They were characterized as shoals of infantry by one contemporary observer. So not very many and not very reliable. Especially at the senior levels, we think of colonels and generals all taking orders these days, but the nobles, the nobility back at that point, they would fight when it served their purposes, and then they would not fight when it didn't serve their purposes.
And it was very service was very. I'm sure there's a much better word for this, but it was all very oath centric. It was all very based on these sort of verbal and social understandings or agreements with someone else.
It was very conditional.
Yeah.
If I will serve you if you do this for me. Now,
Exactly.
by the end of the Middle Ages, that had changed. The military revolution
It did.
transformed that. But early in the Middle Ages, it was very much, I will do this for you if you do this for me.
You just mentioned a very, very dangerous topic for me. You just mentioned the military revolution, which played a huge role in my.
So did you see this other question though, Rand, from Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer?
That was actually the next one I was going to. That was the next one I was going to choose. And I guess this is directed to Dr. Latham, but he says, do you subscribe to the notion that the Fourth Crusade, if we can even call it a crusade, never intended to attack Egypt, but its real target was Constantinople from the start?
No, I don't. I think they had noble aspirations, but the tensions between Latin and Byzantine Christendom from the time of the First Crusade onwards were really, they were palpable. They were problematic.
Yeah.
And I think my sense is, and who can know for sure, but the Latins had just had it with the Byzantines in 1204, and they were diverted. I think that's how I would put it.
Yeah.
I would agree with that as well, and I know we've had a couple of podcasts, if I recall, on the Fourth Crusade, and I think that's the overall conclusion is that at least from the sources and from what we have available to us, that yes, that was not the intention. It's just it was complicated and things happened and they couldn't be undone, and there we are. So
yeah. Let's see. We got a couple other good questions here. Let's see. Cody 2000 wants to know, was it common for women like Eleanor of Aquitaine to accompany their husbands during the Crusades? Yeah, I would say so.
Very.
I would say it was common both for noble women and for what's the opposite of noble? Ignoble commoners to accompany their spouses, or to especially amongst the let's say the lower orders to crusade on their own, especially the First Crusade. There's stories of many peasants, male, female, children, the Children's Crusade, just upping and leaving and heading out. But it is especially true, I think, of the nobility.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, Jinsul wants to know if we can name all the factions in the Middle East in the 12th century, and the answer to that is no, we cannot.
With an exclamation mark. No, no, we cannot.
When if you think of like all the little independent Arab city-states,
Oh, good Lord.
then yeah, I mean,
I would just throw in the Nizari, right? The assassins.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite topics.
They don't fit in anywhere. They're not
Yeah.
quite Sunni. They're not quite Shia. They're allied. They're tributaries of the Templars for a while, but then they turn on the Templars. I mean, and that's just at the tip of a very complicated iceberg.
Yeah.
That's why they're so great, because they're heretics.
I've always had a sneaking respect for them, to be honest.
Mm.
Well, and they did sort of have this attitude of like, we really don't care what anybody else is doing. We're going to do our own thing. And it was whether it be Christian, Muslim, we really don't care.
And if you bother us, we will kill you.
Yeah, exactly. They were kind of the you can almost say they were kind of they were almost sort of the Mormons of or at least the 19th century Mormons.
I've never heard it put that way before, but yep.
Oh man. Okay. Let's see. What about the conquest of Spain? What was the day-to-day like? I assume it wasn't wholesale slaughter. They kept the Christians as a tax and labor base. Yeah, both sides did that. You know, both sides. We've gone over this before, but yeah. When Christians conquered Muslims, they usually kept them around, and when Muslims conquered Christians, they usually kept them around. And in both cases, it was because if they would work the land and pay taxes. So
the only qualification I would sort of offer is that it wasn't this convivencia. Everybody got along together. There were periods.
Right.
There were periods when people did get along together, and then there were periods of religious extremism in which, on the Muslim side, Jews and Christians were persecuted, and on the Christian side, Muslims were persecuted. Again, it doesn't boil down to a romanticized notion that Muslim Spain was somehow this wonderful multicultural political thing. It was sometimes, as it was in Sicily, but often these waves of fundamentalism rendered life for non-Orthodox Muslims really kind of treacherous.
Did we answer Quill and Ink's questions? Quill and Ink History's questions? He had a good one. It was a question for Latham and the RCH team. Why did the Crusades and Reconquista not continue in North Africa, such as Algeria and Tunisia?
They did a little bit. They tried. I think. I kind of wonder.
Well, and they actually succeeded after what we would call the traditional medieval period, more like into the early modern period. Spain and Portugal actually did. That's how we get Spanish Morocco. You know, they actually did, and Ceuta and places like that. They actually did establish quite a presence in North Africa.
And the Crusaders, including right up through the Ninth Crusade, the target was often Cairo and Alexandria.
Yep.
Right, it's a jumping off point for liberating the Holy Land. So North Africa, as we understand it today, wasn't out of the picture. It was often quite central.
Yeah.
Anyway, shout out to Quill and Ink History real quick. He makes some good videos on the history of Christianity and science in the medieval era. So how you doing in history? So good to hear from him.
And Patty McGill says, can you think of an example where reverence for the Blessed Mother motivated the Crusaders? And that does make me think of the Prussian Crusade, which this idea developed that the Baltic was kind of like Mary's land in the same way that Palestine was Christ's domain. And so the Teutonic Knights sort of had a special devotion to Christ's mother. And in fact, in their oath, when they took their vows, they took a vow to Christ and his mother, whereas at the Templars it was just to Christ, I believe. Of course, all of the Catholic world honored all of medieval Christendom honored Mary, but the Teutonic Knights seem to have had kind of like a special
Well, there's some very beautiful Marian-related shrines built by the Crusaders in Outremer. The one I'm thinking of in particular is the church that's, and unfortunately I'm blanking on its name, but it's the church right outside the Damascus gate of Old Jerusalem, and it's near kind of where the Mount of Olives is. And it's got that very iconic barrel vault that goes downwards into the ground. And I was there about 2 years ago, and it's where I believe the Eastern rites allege was the tomb of Mary. But it's also where it was also a very famous Norman Crusader church, and built during the reign of Queen Melisande, and it's actually where Queen Melisande is buried, or alleged to have been buried, along with a lot of other Latin Outremer noblemen and women, and that church is I believe it's the premier sort of Marian, or it was the site of the premier sort of Marian devotion to during the Crusader era. And again, I'm blanking on the name, unfortunately. Church of the Dormition, maybe, I think. I can't remember.
Right, the Dormition sounds right.
Yeah.
I got distracted by this other question from Basil II, the Bulgar. Did you guys see this?
Yeah. Jinsul was telling them not to troll. Jinsul, it's all right. It's all right. Let Basil have his fun.
So Basil II asks, and I think this actually is the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, isn't it? He's on here. He says, "Could I please have an answer to this? Why is Nightfall literally the most historically accurate and truthful account of the fall of the Templars, rivaled only by Kingdom of Heaven in its truth?"
Don't start me on Kingdom of Heaven.
So, ha. Thank you, Basil II, terror of the Bulgars, the poor Bulgars.
Are there Bulgars who could be slaying right now? Like,
I feel like a terrorized Bulgar myself now after that question.
After that question, yeah.
I love how, like, in the Facebook group, though, like, we were, like, looking at a post and we were like, oh, how horrible this thing that Basil did. Just right now,
it was pretty bad. I mean, it's ranks up there with one of the great atrocities in medieval history.
Are we talking about the long daisy chain of blinded Bulgars led by the one who still had his one eye left? Yeah,
it's morbid. Well, it's more than morbid. It's
more than morbid. It's Byzantine. I tell people all the time that because everybody, because of the popularity of the TV series, and because of this just oft repeated, which I think George R.R. Martin started himself, but this idea that the Game of Thrones is based on the War of the Roses, and I'm like, actually, the War of the Roses was never that exciting. And I said, you really want something that's similar to Game of Thrones. Read Byzantine history.
Oh yeah.
It's way more eye gouging and way less incest. Like,
especially like in the period of the Crusades too. Like before the First Crusade, you've got the whole business with Romanus Diogenes and Nicephorus, and then the Komneni family. Really exciting stuff.
Oh yeah, it's and just the things they did to each other. It was just like, oh my god. Like, I mean, I think we've mentioned this in podcasts that we had on the Fourth Crusade and whatnot. But I think there was kind of this sort of visceral cultural disgust that many of the Latins had with the Byzantines and with just the way they did things. And I think there was kind of this. Okay, we're not supposed to be doing this, but these people are so god awful to each other. Like, I can actually kind of feel good about sacking their city. I'm sure there was a little bit of that.
Have you guys read that? Have you guys read that book where there's some historian who argues that 1204 was revenge for the way Frederick Barbarossa was treated by the Byzantines during the Third Crusade, which
Not a book is that.
I mean, it seems a little simplistic, but
yeah, but I
it
think
definitely
so
wouldn't
too.
surprise me if if there were certain individuals who maybe that was just yet another grievance.
Anyway, so I think we're kind of coming towards the end of things here. Does anybody have any further comments? And Andrew, I want to open the floor up to you, especially since you are our esteemed guest here.
No, I think we've covered the waterfront here tonight. I've really enjoyed this. I'm not sure about Basil II's questions, but I would say this. I think that the Latin Christian loathing of the people that they called Byzantines rivaled their loathing of the Muslims. Theologically, politically, practically, they had some very bad experiences. They were all nominally Christians, but not friendly. Periodically, they would form alliances of convenience, but not overall friendly. The Latins really loathed the Orthodox.
Yeah, and vice versa, I would say.
And vice versa, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, but yeah, so that's good. I think we've had a really good episode. This was this is a lot of fun. Dr. Andrew Latham, we appreciate having you on, and we would like to have you back on again soon. So, are there any books you want to plug right now, or anything like that?
That would be unseemly, but yes.
Good.
So I have re-released my novel, The Holy Lance, with some new chapters. There's that, and there is a book on the birth of the idea of sovereignty, which will be of interest to about 3 people in the world. But it's only $2.99. So
I'll be one of those.
yeah, can't
Yeah.
really go wrong.
Add us all to the list.
Yeah, that's. I think you found your 3 people, 4, probably including Scott.
Yeah, I got my copy before anybody
He
else.
did. Scott was the earliest. That's right.
I intended
We ordered it before the podcast.
I got it when Dr. Latham was he had a giveaway going.
Oh,
He did, but the
nice.
downside is, Scott, there's a test. There's an exam coming up.
Oh no.
I would also make a plug for another one of your books, sir, and it's actually one that I'm reading right now, and it's of interest to me not only as a historian but also as someone who originally had a political science background, and that is your theorizing medieval geopolitics.
Oh,
book. Very, very, very interesting. It speaks to both the political scientist and the historian.
that's great to hear. I'm very proud of that work, and every time I hear somebody say something nice about it, yeah, that makes me feel good.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome.
All right.
Now you have re-released the Holy Lance with some additional material. Is that
That's
correct?
right. There's 3 new chapters.
Okay.
It's kind of the setup for the sequel, but there's lots of the Nizari, the assassins in there. I really like the new chapters.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to take another look at it. I've wondered what happened with your fiction writing, because I noticed you've been working on a couple of new academic books, and so I guess it had just taken a back seat to that. I didn't realize you lost your publisher and stuff.
Yeah, and my provost said maybe more academic stuff. You know what provosts are like.
Yeah. And just in case anybody's interested, Dr. Latham did write a really excellent novel about the Templars, the Holy Lance, which you can pick up. I think probably a fair amount of the people in our group tonight have read it. I know that a lot of our regulars are in here, and it was a pretty popular book among our regulars. So good deal.
Well, thank you. And again, this has been a wonderful thing. Happy to come back anytime.
All right, great. Well, we'll certainly have you back, Dr. Latham. Andrew.
All right.
Okay, thanks, guys, for helping out, and we'll talk to everybody real soon.
All right. Good night.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.